All right, we will call the Ways and Means hearing for May 14th to order. Sharita, please call the roll.
Alderwoman Davis.
Present.
Alderman Vaccaro.
Present.
Alderwoman Howard.
Present.
Alderwoman Hubbard.
Present.
Alderwoman Murphy.
Present.
Alderwoman Spencer. Alderman Muhammad.
Present.
Alderman Oldenburg.
Present.
Alderwoman Boyd.
Present.
Alderwoman Clark Hubbard.
Here.
Chairman Ballmer.
Present.
10 present, you have quorum.
All right, thank you so much. We will entertain a motion for approval of the minutes from our last meeting.
I'll make
I
that
make
motion.
so
to
moved.
approve
Entertain a second.
it.
Second.
Second.
Okay, Sharita, please call the roll.
Alderwoman Davis.
Aye.
Alderman Vaccaro.
Aye.
Alderwoman Howard.
Aye.
Alderwoman Hubbard.
Aye.
Alderwoman Murphy.
Aye.
Alderwoman Spencer. Alderman Muhammad.
Aye.
Alderman Oldenburg.
Aye.
Alderwoman Boyd.
Aye.
Alderwoman Clark Hubbard.
Aye.
Chairman Ballmer.
Aye.
10 aye votes.
All right, thank you, Sharita. We will hold off with excuse Alderman until the end of the meeting. At this point, I would.
I needed this long phone.
Excuse me? Okay. We, our first order of business today, before we go with Paul Payne's presentation, will be Board Bill 16 from the Comptroller's office. This is the tax revenue anticipation notes of what they call the trans bill. And I will turn it over. I'll to Latanya. Are you be handling this?
Yes, I will.
Okay, if you're in the hot seat. And at that point, we will entertain a motion to hear Board Bill number 16.
I have to
Alderman Murphy?
unmute myself. I'll make a motion that we do that.
Okay.
I had to unmute myself.
All right, with that, Latanya, you're in the hot seat. Please go ahead with Board Bill 16.
Good morning to the Ways and Means Committee. My name is Latanya Kenner, Deputy Comptroller for Finance and Development. And first, I would like to thank Alderman Ballmer for sponsoring Board Bill number 16. And I would also like to note and thank Alderwoman Shameen Hubbard and Alderman Joe Ballmer for accepting to co-sponsor the bill. Board Bill number 16, Tax and Revenue Anticipation Notes for fiscal year 2020, authorizes the borrowing of short-time notes for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2021. The notes will assist the city in financing its cash flow requirements during the fiscal year to allow the city to cover periods of temporary cash flow deficits resulting from uneven flow of revenues. This board bill states a cap of 65 million, also projected cash flow deficits and borrowing of approximately 40 to 45 million this year. This is the 37th consecutive year for this borrowing, and we are expecting to price the notes in mid-June. Our notes are also rated by Standard & Poor's, and some additional information is last year, the core amount for this note was 45 million, and the prior year in 2019 was 45, and 2018 was 66 million. I also have Beverly Fitzsimmons, if you have additional information on how we arrived at our amounts, and also if you need market information, Joyce Opensky from Stern Brothers is also in this meeting. Are there any questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Latonya. We'll go in order scenario. Alderwoman Davis, any questions of the sponsor? Or the comptrollers?
No, no questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Alderman Vaccaro, any questions?
I do, just real quickly, I know that we have to pay this back every year. And with the uncertainty of how the tax money's coming in and all that, our ability to pay that back, what happens if we run short and can't pay it back at the end of the year?
Beverly, are you on the line?
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, we have to pay it back. It's a debt service. In debt services usually, or is not usually, is a priority of the city spending. So we do anticipate, like Latonya said, 40 to 45 million. This is the general fund cash flow. So it's the look at the operating fund of the department of the city.
Right. So, hey, Paul,
I mean, I think if we can't pay back 40 million at the end of the year, then we have bigger problems, to tell you the truth.
well, I mean, but this budget's tight and they're cutting a lot of stuff. I mean, Paul, you're pretty confident that. I mean, I know we got to pass this. It's just more something I'm just curious.
Yeah, this is a cash flow management tool. There's two separate issues, and I'll get into the budget in terms of how it's balanced and all this kind of. But the other one you're talking about is just managing cash flow, and so that's not typically one that we've had a trouble with in terms of paying off, because it's just basically you're saying, all right, we've got more revenues coming in the fall than in the summer, but our expenditures are more evenly distributed. So we need to manage our abilities so that our outlays are covered until the revenues come in. And yet, so this isn't a budget tool. This is more of a cash flow tool. And so it's not a consideration when we start talking about other debt. So for instance, when you have to pay for projects and such, where it actually is impacts the budget more.
All right, thank you, Paul.
I appreciate. Thank you, Joe. I'll mute myself now.
That'd be great. Alderwoman Howard, any questions?
I love the humor. I have a question. One, this has been done for 37 years, and we were in a high hay before all this crash, and the coronavirus took hold. This is something we do every year, regardless, to supplement any lags in cash as it comes in. In other words, if there's a deficit in collecting taxes from the state or whatever, this helps us get through and be able to still meet our payroll and our obligations. Is that correct?
Yes.
I see a lot of it. Please give a vocal answer. Yes, thank you.
Okay, what is our bond? Okay, and does this affect our bond rating doing this?
No, it does not. No. It is rated by S&P, but it doesn't affect the GOB bond rating of the city. No.
Can you repeat that again, Beverly? You kind of broke up.
It is a rated note, per se, but it does not affect the overall bond rating of the city.
And do we pay interest on this?
Yes.
Yes. And what rate are we?
I can tell you last year's rate was a 2%. This year, I am not sure what that would be.
Okay. So it depends on the market, I guess.
Right.
Okay.
And we tend to price mid-June on this.
Okay. So just like I'm sorry.
Alderwoman Howard, in response to your question, Stern Brothers has quoted a 3% coupon to yield of 1.04% this year.
Okay, that's good. All right, thank you. That's all I have.
All right, Alderwoman Hubbard, any questions?
No questions.
All right. Alderwoman Murphy, any questions? Beth, any questions?
No questions.
No questions. Thank you very much. Alderwoman Spencer, any questions?
My questions have been answered. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Alderman Muhammad, any questions for you, sir? I hear no answer. All right, Alderman Oldenburg, any questions?
No questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Alderwoman Boyd, any questions?
My question is, and she might have answered it, I might have missed it. I heard Alderwoman Howard talk about the bonds, and so will that impact our credit rating at any point?
No, it should not.
Okay, thank you. I have no other questions. Thank you.
All right. Alderwoman Shamim Hubbard, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
All right, thank you all very much. I'm fine with this. Latanya, you're welcome to close.
Thank you very much. I would like to say thank you to the committee for hearing Board Bill number 16 today, and we do request committee's approval for this Board Bill for the fiscal year 2020 trans.
I'd like to make a motion
And I'll second that motion.
to pass
Okay.
Board Bill 16 out of committee with a due pass recommendation.
All right, thank you very much. Sharita, call the roll.
Alderwoman Davis,
Aye.
Alderman Vaccaro,
Aye.
Alderwoman
Aye.
Howard.
Aye.
Alderwoman Hubbard,
Aye.
Alderwoman Murphy.
Aye.
Alderwoman Spencer,
Aye.
Alderman Muhammad,
Aye.
Alderman Oldenburg,
Aye.
Alderwoman Boyd,
Aye.
Alderwoman Clark Hubbard,
Aye.
Chairman Ballmer.
Aye.
11 aye votes.
Thank you.
Okay, we have passed Board Bill 16 with a due pass recommendation. And thank you everyone from the Comptroller's office. If you're hanging around, feel free, but we're gonna go into Mr. Payne. Paul, we will got you in the hot seat, and I will make a motion to entertain Board Bill number 1, the budget of St. Louis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the committee.
Paul, you there?
Yes, I'm here. I did send out a PDF version of the revised presentation, which you should have. If not, I'm going to try to screen share for today's meeting, and then it will also be posted online after today. So if you bear with me, see if this works. I don't know why it's not advancing. Oh, there we go. Okay, is everyone able to see what I have on screen?
Got it.
Okay, very good. All right, starting with the second slide. The proposed annual operating plan for fiscal 2021 is $1,116.4 million. That's a decrease of 2.9% over the previous fiscal year. And if you look, as you know, the budget is comprised of a number of funds, the general fund being the largest of those at $495 million, which is a decline of 4.7%. I did want to point out that looking at budget numbers is a little different than looking at revenue. And I've got I'm going to be going into very specifics, a lot of specifics on the revenue assumptions, because the revenue assumptions actually is about a 6.5% projected decline. So we'll get into that difference detail. Under the special revenue funds, $183.2 million, that's a decline of 1.1%. Again, that's a little deceptive there because we do have some new funds that weren't in last year's budget. For instance, we got the Cure Violence appropriation that's going to be this year about $2.3 million. We've got a $6.5 million appropriation for the GEMT, that's a ground emergency management transfer program that was budgeted under a fund this year. And then we have a special fund increase for a corrections special fund, which is the federal marshal reimbursement, and some increases of allocations from the EcoDevo fund of $2.4 million. So that sort of masks a lot of the underlying declines in some of the other base revenues in those special revenues. For instance, the use tax down at 3.7 million, public safety sales tax is down 3.5 million, and the public safety sales and use tax is another 1.3 million. So there are some other, you got to really look in the details of the numbers to see what's going on there. Grant funds at 67.4 million, that's 3.6% decline. debt service fund is actually up to 7.8 million, and that reflects our first year's anticipation of our issuance of the first year bonds related to Prop NS, which was estimated at $6 million as the initial installment. Capital improvement funds at $28.5 million. That's a decline of 21.7%. Now that's where you can see some definitely pure decline due to sales tax and gaming revenue declines in this year's budget. Enterprise funds at 245.5 million is down 0.2%, nearly flat, but that's also a little bit misleading. The airport typically budgets higher, estimates higher revenues, and then their budget is lower. For instance, in the current fiscal year, they were estimating originally at 193 million, but their budget was 174. Well, they've revised their estimate down to 173 for the current fiscal year, and next year's is also down at 174, reflecting their revised revenue estimate. That's a decline of over $20 million, and it's a 10%. So budget to budget doesn't look like a drop, but in actuality, they're reducing their budget to reflect the reduction in revenues. Internal service funds, those are the funds primarily that departments charge each other. It's also the biggest chunk of that is going to be health insurance, where we contribute to the fund there. That's up 2.7%. And you can see in the pie chart below, the general fund represents 44% of the overall budget. Wait for this to change here. There we go. Oh, jumped again. Okay. In terms of the general revenue fund estimate, this is an update basically of where we were looking at the end of the third quarter. So in the last fiscal year, we had $529.6 million. That was the actual receipts in FY19. Now in FY20, we have a budget of $519.3 million. So actually the budget was actually less than what we actually received in the previous fiscal year. We had a strong fiscal fourth quarter last year. Going through the third quarter of this year, which is primarily a pre-COVID-19 impact, we're estimating $529.4 million. So that we were tracking about $10 million over our original budget figure. Most of which, as you can see, was in the earnings tax category, which was budgeted at 180, was coming in estimated at 193. So we were doing pretty well. Earnings tax was up 7.5% or so. But then you ask the question, okay, so what's the impact on the COVID-19 revenue or revenue after COVID-19? And that's what you see in that column, the column next to the third quarter, is an estimate of what the impact would be. Now, there was that totals $481.8 million, and it does include an estimated $19.5 million simply due to the deferral of earnings tax receipts. When the IRS issued a 90-day extension for payment, our earnings tax receipts on corporate receipts are patterned after those due dates. So instead of April 15th, you'd be seeing more revenue in July. So what this is showing is that's actually a deferral. It's not necessarily a loss, but it's a deferral in terms of when we receive it. So it would create on a cash basis a deficit in the current fiscal year, but you would receive it in the coming fiscal year. And for budget purposes, and I'll get into this a little bit more detail, I'm recommending that basically is not treated as FY21 revenue, but it's treated to restore whatever draw on the fund reserves are made because of that deferral. So you can see that based on the FY20 revised receipts, we're estimated a $47.6 million impact of COVID-19. Now, that was the impact of COVID-19, but it's not the gap necessarily, because remember, we were tracking about $10 million over the estimate. So we were looking at a shortfall potentially this current fiscal year of about just under 40 million, 37.5 million for this fiscal year. Now, I'm going to put a caveat in here. There are a lot of assumptions, and we'll get into these a little bit more, going into these numbers. And so the margin for error is unusually large given all that uncertainty. So how do we bridge the current year's gap? And that's this next slide, slide 4, potential steps to eliminate the current year's deficit. Now, in terms of how we were doing this fiscal year, projections for personal services through the 19th pay period, was $5 million. We were tracking under by about $5 million. That incorporates also the net after our lump sum payments that we had in April. And we're also targeting reversions from non-personnel discretionary accounts. And hopefully we can achieve about $4 million from that source. There is also the possibility of having furloughs for those not currently operations that aren't currently operational. That has not been done yet, but that is a potential there, particularly if it continues to go longer. And then other items that would require an appropriation ordinance. For instance, we had just passed an ordinance that put that GEMT revenue I talked about earlier into a special fund. Well, if given the situation has changed, we don't have that luxury of being able to create a special fund, then we would have $4 million released to general revenue, such as what it was last year. As well as the federal prisoner housing, this would assume some of those funds that have not been spent are available, and as well as any 2 months projected revenues in this fiscal year would provide $2.3 million. And then below that, if you recall, we did a supplemental appropriation from last year's surplus that went to capital, and some of those items were funded, as you can see below, about $3.5 million. Told some of those might already be in the pipeline, so we'd have to look and see which ones of those we could grab. But that would be $3.5 million. And then some other miscellaneous items there regarding fund balances and some reallocation there. That's all totals about $19.6 million. But then, as I mentioned, we do have the reserve, the deferred portion, the estimated deferred portion of the earnings tax is estimated at $19.5 million, which would come in July. And so for practical purposes, the idea would be, well, it may come in July, but it's going to be allocated to the reserve simply to make up for that shortfall. So you don't want to count FY20 revenue as FY21 revenue, essentially. And so that would be how we would generally try to bridge this year's gap. And again, there's a lot of moving parts here and a lot of assumptions here. So it's going to be something that we're going to have to continue to watch as the final month of May and June pass. So looking into the estimates for FY21, there we go. This is an illustration just showing some of the major funds and what the potential impact of COVID-19 would have on them. So I've got not only the general fund listed there in total, but a lot of the special funds, primarily a lot of the half-cent sales tax funds and other funds that are based on sales taxes, as well as the gaming fund and such. So if you look at that FY20 third quarter estimate, that's where we were based on mostly pre-COVID-19. We're at $665 million in a lot of those accounts. And this isn't every fund, it's just illustrating where we are on some of those major revenue funds. With the general fund at 529. So with the COVID-19 estimate, we dropped almost $55 million from those accounts, from those various funds, with general fund at 481.8. So the FY21, and this is what's assumed in the base revenue scenario estimate, 495.0 million. That, as I mentioned, that's a 6.5% decline. And then all those other funds would be down over 10, either local use tax, gaming fund, and all those other sales tax funds are over 10% decline there. So just in total, those funds would be down 7.5% to $615.4 million. That's a sizable reduction. That's nearly $50 million off the top there. Just to give you an idea about context, in FY10, which was our worst year in the Great Recession, general fund revenue declined 2.1%. A significant decline, but this is far worse than that. So that would be our base scenario that we're actually what you have in the budget before you. But then thinking about what happens if it's worse, well, then I've got a worse scenario here. And when I say worse, I'm not saying worst, because you don't know what the worst is, but it is worse. And so that also has estimates there showing pretty much doubling the decline of what would be in the base case scenario, which would add another $39 million, which would need to be reduced, and total loss from third quarter revenues of $89 million. Going to the next slide, if I can get there. And here's one of the keys of this approach is identifying some of the assumptions that those revenues are based on. So on the left, of this slide, what you have is what's in the base proposal. So in FY20, this includes things like the 80% loss of hospitality and leisure wages in the fourth quarter, a loss of 100% of cultural and sports wages. This is basically BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out reports about what St. Louis's salary and wages totals would be for those industries. And that would be basically calculating that we'd lose that amount in the fourth quarter. A loss of 30% of all other wages in the fourth quarter. 80% of business profits deferred until July and August. Again, that's at 19.5 deferral. But in FY21, this would continue the losses, although not as steep as the fourth quarter, but it would remain down 10% for the year until the fourth quarter of next year, where it recovers. So we wouldn't obviously assume that we'd be shut down to the same extent as the current quarter. And in the worst scenario, what that would do is take it down 20% as opposed to 10%. Similarly, with the payroll tax, it's assumed to correspond with the earnings tax as well, with the 80% of hospitality losses and the 100% of cultural sports wages, as well as 30% of all other wages in FY20, and then a 10% decline in the base scenario, a 20% decline going forward in the worst case scenario. Sales taxes, 50% drop assumed beginning mid-March through May. And again, with sales taxes, you've got a 2-month lag between activities. So for instance, all their March activity is mostly received in the month of May, and then in any activity in May is received in the month of July. So that has more of an impact on FY21 than perhaps the other two. So we're projecting in the base case activity in June down 40% with each month recovering 10% of that until December. So basically, we're on this base scenario, we're trying to get back to normal or assuming you get back to normal sometime at the end of the calendar 2020, whereas the worst case scenario defers that a little bit more, where it's only 5% increments and you get back maybe a year from now. That's how long that would take. On the next slide, it actually addresses some more of those. Here we go. Let's go back up. I jumped. There we go. For instance, the hotel tax. That has been that's been one of the hardest hit of the. I don't know why this is jumping around. It's sort of a lag between my. The hotel tax is projected to be down 90% in the mid-March through May, and then gradually increase through the subsequent months, so that it recovering 20% each month, and then it gets back to somewhat of a normal base in December. However, and as we go about tracking this thing from month to month, we're seeing it may take longer. Then the worst scenario would have to be that it only recovers 10% a month and it doesn't get back to a normal base in March. Now that, again, is based on a lot of assumptions. The restaurant tax, again, also pretty hard hit in this current quarter. We're projecting a drop of 80% in mid-March through May, with a one-month lag in receipts, and then gradually recovering throughout the rest part of this calendar year. And then again, but that would drag into the next calendar year on the worst scenario. Local use tax was down 7% as of April, and this would estimate it down to 10%. In the worst scenario, it would take it down 20%. The gaming fund, as you know, casinos are closed currently. So we have no receipts in mid-March through May, although I'm told that, as we reported in the news, that it's supposed to be reopened in June. So if you assume activity in June is down 80% with each month, recovering 20% until the normal base in December, and then in the alternative scenario, it gets up to that normal base, but 10% less than that. So that you can just see what this does is basically trying to say, all right, what's your base scenario, and then what a worst scenario would look like, and go from there. And these will be informed as each month passes in the coming fiscal year. I know this slide comes up. Okay, I jumped again. Here we are. In the projected, this next slide on slide 8, if I can ever get there, it reflects what the projected gap would be for next fiscal year. We do this every year as sort of an estimate of what we could be what we're looking at in terms of what's the size of the problem we're facing. And in recent years, it's been somewhat benign. We usually have a gap. It's been in recessions, it gets really bad. And then when it was growing, it was single digits, double digits, millions. Last year was probably the single digits. But this year, obviously, after the third quarter, we're looking at a major decline and a major growth in the gap. So the beginning base budget at 519.2, we were exceeding that in the $10 million range. But then you throw in the COVID-19 impact of under almost $50 million, $48 million or so. And then the increment less than whatever growth or recovery that we would see in 21, less that, the 13.3 million. That gives us our starting base of $495 million. Then we got some increases. Pay matrix increases for police and fire, that's 1.5 million for police. And then we've got a pension decrease of 0.6 million. And then a decline in revenue from supporting funds. And this is sort of important because we have a lot of special funds, particularly the sales tax funds, which when they're doing well, it's fine. But when they are declining, if they decline to a point where they're going to go deficit, then the general fund's the stopgap. And so there are a number of those where the police, particularly with the police department, is scattered across a number of funds. But if that fund is no longer sufficient to support it, then the general fund has to pick that up. And that was about $4.9 million in this coming fiscal year. Fire is some of the same things. The fire pension increase is $0.8 million there. And it had a public safety sales tax decrease of 0.3. Again, we had the impact of the minimum wage increase, which went up, I believe, in February. That's $2.3 million. Non-uniform pay increases. This is last year's merit increase. We were now, when it comes to the pay plan, in looking ahead to this budget, we typically don't budget anything for that. At a 1.5 merit scheduled throughout the year, we were estimating most departments could eat that cost. Well, we were anticipating, given that it was a 3%, that would be a little much, and we were going to budget for that. I'll talk about this a little later, but that would have been all those increases there would have been $5.4 million. We ended up not putting that amount in there simply because of the challenges. Some of our Justice Center lease debt obligations, the Justice Center went down by $1.5 million. We do have some promotional, police and fire promotional testing at Department of Personnel, about $300,000. Board of Elections, every other year is an election year, so we've got 4 scheduled elections, and that's a $1.2 million hit. And then some equipment services encountering some increased costs of fleet maintenance. So that would be a $435 million, or just under 435, which is a $40 million gap. So how do we address that gap? And that goes on to the next slide, which is a combination of budget cuts, some revenue reallocations, and some special fund revenues. The budget cuts comprise of $10.2 million, and I'll go those in specifics. The largest cut is the Department of Corrections, where MSI's budget has been reduced significantly. And then other cuts scattered across department. And as I mentioned, no additional funds for merit pay increases. And that's a net reduction of 88 positions. Now, there are some revenue reallocations in this as well, $22.1 million. That includes reallocating from the half-cent ward capital account of $7.5 million and the recreation capital account of $0.4 million. Some economic development funds, which have some available balances there, subsidizing both PDA at $300,000, human services at $200,000. And then we had, in previous years, set aside funds for what is known as the Public Safety Answering Point, the PSAP. This was a project that was going to combine various emergency dispatcher operations, police, fire, EMS, those kind of things, which had been set aside but not yet spent. And so one of the things we're proposing here is that would be deferred, and so we'd be able to utilize those unspent funds. Special funds, as I mentioned, the EMS GMT fund of $3.8 million would be basically assuming some of the costs of the fire department instead of special funds. And then corrections at $5.3 million. That's the federal housing reimbursements. Public safety and sales and use tax, the circuit attorney, those are some unspent funds there as well as recreation. So that's the $22.1 million. Under the special fund revenues, there was a significantly large balance of unspent monies as well from we are self-funded as when it comes to prescription funds, prescription insurance, part of our insurance plan for that the city uses. And it had a $12.8 million balance as of the end of FY19. So this utilized about 9.8 million of that, but that's not all general revenue because all departments participate in that. So that net reduction was 7.4 million to the general fund. And so that, in a nutshell, is the $40 million in total of those three efforts for trying to come up with a balanced scenario. Starting on slide 10, you can see some of the details per each department. General Government and Finance, it's had a net decrease following an upgrade last year that we had for PCs. City Councilor has reduced one position. Comptrollers and Communication Services were actually up 200,000. That's we've seen that increase in the number of departments. Supply was net one position reduced, and then some of those. Now this excludes some of those reallocated funds. Non-departmental workers' comp was down 200,000. We are still budgeting for the state audit, although my understanding is that it's been slowed down a bit. So while this was going to originally be our third and final year, we do anticipate that some of those costs will continue in FY22. So it's been reduced by 300,000, but there will probably be a smaller allocation next year as well. The assessor subsidy, simply because they had is down 200,000, but they had a balance, projecting a balance there. And trans interest is about 100,000 there. And then underneath that, I noted that I did not, we included any allocation for those citywide merit pay increases. So that's 1.9 million decrease. Parks and Forestry, you can see 3 vacant positions were cut and some miscellaneous reductions as well, about 300,000. Judicial offices have some miscellaneous cuts as well. They are increased in the juvenile department of about $300,000, reflecting that raise the age legislation that went into effect last year, and that basically increases the age of juveniles that were held there from 17 to 18. And some city courts per performance and other increases less than $100,000. In the county offices, excluding the board of elections, what I talked about earlier, medical examiner does have an increase of $200,000, reflecting their contractual service net cost increases. In the street departments, we have an $800,000 net decrease, although it does include the Director of Streets blocking initiative, which was, I think that was Board Bill 239 that passed its most recent session. The DNR loan and the traffic division is actually down 400,000. That's simply because it's tied to the progress of the project. And some of the projects, I think, on facilities have been delayed until next year. And the way that loan is structured is paid from savings from the project itself. So until you actually complete the project and start realizing savings, you're not paying on it. So that's why that's deferred. And on the next page, public safety is where you have a lot of the big reductions. Well, fire department contractual services are up $200,000, and the building division is down a position. But MSI is down $7.6 million, reflecting a lot of their decline in their prisoner census, and they're also down 89 positions. Now, this does reflect a transport unit for the Justice Center of 12 positions that is in the special funds, so they're up, so that's $600,000. And then contractual services for the Justice Center are also up 2.2 million. And the police department, there's 10 vacant positions that have been cut. Their workers' comp is down and their overtime is down. It's basically got the same number of uniforms, although you'll note that the grant funded portion is actually down, the general fund side is up. So you can see that trade-off there. Under the Board of Public Service, they're down a couple $100,000. That's DPS President's Office is down a position. Facilities Management is also down a position. And then, of course, I mentioned the equipment services being up about 300,000. So that's about 10.2 million net in cuts. Moving to the next slide. There we go. General fund revenue outlook. I've gone over this a little bit before, but so I won't repeat myself. But you can see that the estimated revenue FY21, at least that base case of $495 million. You'll note that I took out that 19.5 because that's considered as deferred revenue from FY20. That's a decline of 6.5%, which would be a 2.8% increase over the FY20 COVID-19 impacted revenues. And again, on the chart below, you can see earnings tax at 34%. That's our largest source of those funds. On the expenditures, whoops, I just jumped a slide here. On the expenditures, again, this shows you the change on a year-to-year basis in the various departments. I won't go into the details there, but you can see some of the bigger numbers on a percentage basis. Non-departmental, that decline of 35.1%, that reflects a lot of the reallocations, some of the debt service items that we reallocated into special funds. And then the 16.6% increase in county offices, that's again, mostly the Board of Election Commissioners, which is providing for the elections that we're going to have in the next fiscal year. Public safety and the general fund, again, remains the largest portion, which is 56%, as you can see by the pie chart below. Moving on to some of the proposed changes in, keeps jumping, in special funds. The local use tax fund. Local use tax fund was, as I mentioned, was down 7.2% as of April. It's revised estimate of 34.1 million. It was tracking, it was short of estimates. The FY21 estimate, at least on the base case, assumes a 20% decline, and that's $30.7 million. There's also a beginning balance that we're appropriating there. For affordable housing, this reflects they're getting their full $5 million plus a $55,000 fund balance, plus $1 million as a result of E&A's meeting. As you recall, we added $1 million to that allocation so that they're flat at $6 million total. Last year's budget was 6.6. That included a $600,000 from prior year unspent funds. Healthcare trust funds full allocation of $5 million. And we have reduced the building demolition allocation to $1 million, which is $2 million below its normal allocation. And after you make those allocations, the rest is referred to as excess use tax fund. That's $21.9 million. And you can see with the items funded with it, the big changes there. Police at $10.6 million is a $700,000 decrease. Health division 7.8 is the largest share of that budget. It also included last year we had $350,000 for the forestry's weed program, but obviously since we were with the projected decline in the use tax, we didn't have those funds available this year. In the economic development sales tax fund, it's estimated at $18.5 million. That's a projected decline of 11.5% from our third quarter estimate. We're also, as I mentioned, appropriating about $5 million from unspent appropriated funds, and you can see below where those are going. In transit, by ordinance, 60% of that goes for transit purposes. Again, that's theoretically involves the study of Metrolink expansion. There's $1.5 million appropriated there. I can say that at the end of FY20, there were $30.9 million in that account, and if revenues come in as projected in FY21, there'd be over $40 million in that transit fund account. Neighborhood stabilization, that includes PDA budgets for PDA and CDA at $4 million. That includes a $2.2 million balance there. Workforce development, which is primarily Slate and Human Services, they have funds there budgeted at $2.6 million, which is also including their 10% plus $700,000 in balances. And the public safety infrastructure piece, which is 10% of the budget of the revenues from that fund. It includes funding for 911 communications as well as SEMA. That's a reduction of $1.1 million in FY21 funds, plus $2.4 million in unspent PSAP funds that I mentioned before. So that total is only $0.8 million this year. And city infrastructure, these funds go to the capital fund, 10% of the revenues. Now, in addition to that regular 10% allocation, this includes the reallocated monies from public safety infrastructure of the $3.5 million, which we're using to offset the cost, both in the convention center asset preservation cost, which would be $2 million, and the enterprise center debt, which is $1.5 million. So $3.5 million has been reallocated for those purposes. So that's a total budget of $23.9 million for that fund. In terms of the half-cent public safety sales and use tax known as Prop P, if you recall, that comprised of two pieces. There's the sales tax revenue, which like the economic development sales tax fund is estimated at $18.5 million or 11.5% decline. And then there's the use tax piece. This is basically that portion of the use tax which can be attributed to that rate increase of the sales tax. Both of those are estimated to decline next year in total $22 million. As to the sales tax portion, by ordinance, 66% of that amount should go to the police department, and that's $12.2 million plus a $400,000 balance, and that will pay for the $6,000 increase which is given in the FY19 fiscal year. If you recall, in this year's budget, we had an amount for additional equipment because we did have additional revenues to that fund, but we don't have that projected this coming year. So that is strictly pay and benefits. Same thing with the fire department, which gets 28% of that total. It's $5.2 million total budget. And the circuit attorney is allocated 6% of that amount. Now, they do also have a $1.3 million estimated balance, and so that amount is budgeted at $2.4 million. Into the use tax portion, after school and jobs is allocated 25% of the projected revenue. And most of that is through youth jobs and youth cadets programs. And that $225,000 for youth jobs is a $100,000 decrease from the current fiscal year simply because we're estimating the decline in revenue. That's $900,000. Circuit attorney also gets a share of the use tax portion at 7.7%. That's about $300,000. Rec programs, 25% plus unspent balance from this year. It's about $1.5 million. Building demolition also gets a share of 17.3%. Plus unfunded for unspent balance of $400,000. That gives them another $1 million in this fund. And social works and mental health purposes get 25% of that allocation, which with $300,000 for human services and contracts amounts of $1.2 million in total. So that use tax portion is $4.9 million appropriation. As I mentioned, one of the biggest declines you're going to see in this budget is the capital improvements budget, which totals $28.5 million, which is a decline of 22% from the previous fiscal year. That's a $7.9 million decline. To help offset, and most of that involves reallocations from both the half-cent ward accounts and direct capital accounts, and so you can see in the pie chart where those fit in. Again, existing citywide debt totals $17.2 million, and that's the largest portion of the capital budget. And it does involve deferring some of our other capital items. Basically, it's focusing more on the debt service and making sure we have all of those covered and deferring the others. In terms of personnel, this shows you, this next slide shows you some of the changes in total funds changes by department, all funds. And the general fund, you can see, is an 89, the 4,958 is a decline of 89 positions. Most of those are in corrections, about 88 positions, but there are a number of ups and downs in other departments. Police were up about 11, netting the decline in the grant funds. Juvenile was up 6, general government was down 2, parks were down 3, and streets down 9. That special fund category of 511, that's up 19. That's only because most of that is that transport unit I talked about with the City Justice Center. That's 12 individuals there, positions. And police grants represents most of that decline in grants of 21 positions from the 243 that's budgeted in FY21. And again, enterprise funds are primarily flat. So you're down about 93 positions overall. And that continues, and if you look at the next slide, that continues that decline over the last 10 years. You can see from that, looking at the proposed budget FY21 over the last 10 years, that's over 340 positions down, with the general fund being down the largest amount at 189 positions. Special funds, simply because we've got more special funds than we had previously, are up 32 positions. You can see also a decline in grant funds and enterprise funds. City pension costs, again, this is going to have to be something that we watch closely over the next at least couple of years. So, the overall costs for the FY21 are changing are up to $83.1 million, which is an increase of $1.9 million. That's an PRS, which is the police department, which is retirement system, is actually down 0.6 million. FRS, FRP, which is the two retirement systems for firefighters, was up 0.9 million. And the ERS system, which is the employees' retirement system, was up 1.6 million. And there's a detailed slide, the next slide here, which goes into all those about funded ratios and such between among the 4 systems. We're currently funded nearly at 80% with unfunded liabilities of $452 million. That's not necessarily bad funding level, but unfortunately, we're at the end of this cycle, and it's not. When the last time we went through a recession, and then prior to the last recession, we were over 100% funded. So you would think, when you're having the longest expansion in U.S. history, you'd be a little better funded than this. But the other concern we might have here is that if you look at the funded levels, there's what we call the funded ratio, actuarial basis of 81.8%. Let's talk about employee retirement. And then you've got the market basis. And if you look at those market basis, those are all a little below what the actuarial basis. And that's because on an actuarial basis, valuations are smoothed over a number of years. So ERS, FRS, and PRS all use 5-year smoothing. The fire retirement system, which is frozen, is based on 3-year smoothing. So what that tells you is on a market basis, there are some losses that still need to be recognized. And in terms of the COVID-19 impact, the way these pension costs are budgeted is that the plan year runs through September 30th. So the contributions that we are now making were based on the valuation as of September 30th of last year, September 30th of 2019. So next year, when, depending on where the markets are, and assuming there's a decline of such at the end of September, that will impact our contribution for FY22. Now, again, it's going to be smooth so that you don't have any one year taking a major impact, but the trend is obviously declining there. So pension costs are high, and they continue. Just looking in the short range of these numbers would suggest that they are also going to be going higher in years to come. Now, in terms of the fund balance, this has been a major initiative over the last few years. We have actually made some significant progress in the last couple of fiscal years regarding the fund balance. Now, in the last couple of years, what we've done is we actually received that $10 million contribution from the parking fund recently. We also started budgeting 1.5% of salaries into the fund reserve, just as a normal practice. And so that last year, we'd always set this minimum target of 5%, which was a minimum target. And we hadn't exceeded that since the last recession, when it dropped. But last year we actually went above that, which was good. But most advising authorities, and particularly rating agencies and GFOA, suggest that a fund balance of at least 10% or 2 months of expenditures or one of those things would be more of the target. So what we were trying to move to were 10% of our budget. And we were actually pretty close to getting on our way. At the end of last fiscal year, not only did we set aside funds for the reserve, but we also, as you recall, we had that surplus. And so that helped get us there. So at the beginning of this fiscal year, we had $42.8 million on a cash basis. So now the question in going into FY21, you can see I've got sort of a broken up bar there. That sort of reflects that is if we're successful in bridging this year's gap, but then it also contains that amount that we're expecting. We do expect there to be a decline this year simply because of that deferral of earnings taxes, but then replenish it with when it comes in. And so that's all contingent on being successfully able to bridge the current year's fiscal gap. Now, next year would be a different question, but I think the point of this slide is not only to show that where we stand with the fund balance, but it also highlights the importance of what the general fund unreserved balance is for. It's simply because there is so much uncertainty in this budget, and I believe that the balance is used for things that you don't see coming. If something you see coming, then basically you try to address it with either budget cuts or the like to address. And this is your backstop. I can recall in the last recession, when that came up during the fiscal year, we drew down in 2 successive fiscal years, $18 million in the fund balance. So that's the kind of thing that, that's why it's there, to protect you on the downside. And that's something that that the importance of this is underscored in this situation, particularly with the COVID-19 uncertainty. And this this next slide basically highlights some of the, as I mentioned, I get there. If I mentioned a potential, what happens if it's a worst scenario, and I can't underestimate the fact that I think in talking with a lot of cities now, basically no one really knows the severity and the extent of the downturn that we're looking at. So the key is not necessarily to say, oh, well, I've got the exact estimates and here's how it's going to be and that kind of thing, because no one really knows that. But the key is going to be planning for what you would do in case there's a worse scenario. And so the idea behind this next slide is to give you some idea about options that we could do should revenues actually continue to fall or not meet expectations. And those are the kind of things that we have to be prepared to do. And there's a lot of them on there. We did talk about the affordable housing funds a lot at ENA, obviously. And then, for instance, local use tax building demolition, we still have $1 billion budgeted there. Well, maybe that's something we wouldn't be able to do if revenues take a turn for the worse. There are a lot of variations here of using other funds, for the Economic Development Fund balances which have not been spent, which could be appropriated via ordinance for other purposes. Personnel actions, for instance, I've got on here a pay freeze. I mentioned the fact that we're not budgeting for any merit increases, but if you consider the fact of where we are in this economy, it's funny. Basically, mentioned today is that 36 million are out of work over the last 7 weeks or so. The mindset changes from how much of a pay increase I'm getting to, look, we can try to ensure a job, but pay increases are something that should not be particularly on the table at this point. So those are the kind of things that we should be prepared to be able to take in order to meet this budget challenge and make it basically available so that we don't put ourselves in a box and not being able to respond should revenues continue to fall. Furlough days, that's something we did at our last recession, where we identified 5 holidays and we just basically said these would be unpaid holidays. And this would suggest we could identify those in a pay plan and say 10 furlough days would equal $5 million. Those are the kind of things that, and then additional 5 furlough days for management positions and things like that. Anyway, I don't want to get too much in the detail of the weeds of these contingencies, but I can underscore the importance of being able to plan for scenario should it be less than what's in the budget. And finally, on this final slide, and just in summary, total budget of $1,116.4 million is a 2.9% decrease from the previous year. The general fund at $495 million is a 4.7% decrease, reflecting a 6.5% drop in estimated revenues. And it takes 40 million, covers a nearly $40 million gap in bridged by budget cuts, about $10 million, $22.4 million in funding reallocations, and $7.4 million from the self-insurance fund. Special fund reallocations include the ward and recreation capital accounts, some funds from the economic development funds, as well as some of our special funds there. And again, I can't overemphasize this point that this economic outlook remains uncertain. So with continued downside risk, so we need to make continued planning for should this continue to decline on the revenue side. And even if we get to that point where certain items are appropriated, then we need to manage that smartly so that we're not obligating ourselves such that we don't have the ability to respond to negative developments on the revenue side. And so that to preserve our contingency options. And that pretty much concludes the budget presentation. I'll be available to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. quite a grim picture, eh? Well, we're gonna go around the seniority wise and we'll let the committee give you some questions. Alderwoman Davis, any questions of Mr. Payne? Alderwoman Davis, still there?
Oh, did I unmute myself? Wait a minute.
Okay.
I'm unmuted. Okay.
All
So
right.
I don't necessarily have a question. I have a couple of comments. I'm impressed with the forecast thus far because, as you clearly stated at the end, there are too many things that are still uncertain. But overall, when you're only talking about a little over $1 million that can come into contingency for a full fiscal year, we can manage that when the time comes. We've been in worse positions, so I thank you very much for what you've done thus far. And I wanted to share that some of the things which I'm sure many people will have concerns about when we talk about board ups, demolitions, cutting grass, all those things that kind of fall under environmental health issues that are also connected to COVID-19. Some of that we probably can look at our emergency funds to supplement because we do know we have a high number of asthma in our city, and keeping grass cut, keeping things clean makes a difference because those people are very, very susceptible to getting the virus. But as we move forward, I think that keeping our common sense there is the most important thing. And I thank you again.
All right, Alderman. Thank you very much, Marlene. Alderman Vaccaro.
Paul, a couple things. So the half-cent sales tax that was collected last year, we get to use that in our ward still. Have they replaced in this budget any of the ward capital for dumpsters, trees, sidewalks, streets?
There remains that amount, I believe about $900,000 in refuses budget for dumpsters. That's one of those items that we had added to refuses budget a couple of years ago, and that's still there. Now, I should point out that that's also on my contingency list that I just went over in terms of if things start going south, what else are you going to be starting to look at? And that was on that as well, but it currently isn't still in the budget.
What about the ward capital for streets, sidewalks?
Yeah, the ward capital, in terms of new money, that is not, there is no allocation projected, at least presented in this budget for that. The old money is still there, but the new money, there is no projection of new money.
Well, I have no old money, and we spend whatever so that we can get, things taken care of. And there's a lot of things, a lot of needs through the neighborhood. So, I mean, I have a big concern that we're not going to be taking care of sidewalks or streets in this budget. And just, I guess I'm looking for your suggestions as to how we get that back in there, or some of it back in there.
Well, I can tell you that it's not unusual. And first of all, I agree with you in terms of capital. There's no shortage of need on the capital needs department. But one of the things that you'll see often, particularly when you have a scenario such as this, the severity of decline in revenues, is that typically it's the capital expenditures that get deferred. And that's simply because you're trying to meet some near-term budget gap with whatever sources of funds you have available. And capital tends to be one of those because it's over a longer term. And so that's the approach this budget takes.
Well, I mean, so, and I realize that, but I guess I have real concerns. I mean, people are gonna say, gee, why? And I'll put something out, but people are gonna be upset that they're not getting speed humps, that they're not getting their streets repaired, that they're not getting sidewalks, they're not getting trees. That's gonna be a big issue. I mean, it really is. I mean, at least for the aldermen, it's gonna be, because people are gonna be calling us going, well, I've been on the sidewalk list for the last 28 years and how come, I'm supposed to be getting my sidewalks this year and I'm not getting them? I have real concerns about that. I really do.
And again, and I appreciate those as well. And those are well founded. I think it's funny when you get into a situation like what's unusual about the current situation we're in is the speed with which it's occurred. I mean, if you go back 7 weeks, we weren't even talking about it. We were looking at the third quarter and everything was going well. And everything has just shifted downwards ever since. And that requires a different mindset when you're approaching budgeting and what you can expect, what your realistic expectations are. So usually in a recession, you sort of see things coming a little, and it's a little bit more drawn out. So you sort of adjust your expectations and what you can realistically expect and all. The fact that this has been so sudden a drop and all, the mindsets, we're still in another mindset where we're, oh, well, why can't we have this or that or this? Whereas the reality is the revenues are seeing historic declines here, and we need to be prepared to address those. And it sort of changes what priorities are, and also changes what you can recommend in terms of funding based on that scenario. And again, and that doesn't mean that that's not a need, but I do know that the priority setting in this kind of severe downturn that we're witnessing changes. And I think just the mindset hasn't caught up yet with the reality on the ground is what we're looking at, and that takes time. But I don't disagree with the fact that capital is a big need out there.
So the half-cent sales tax, each ward will still get about, you're saying about what? About 100,000 or roughly in the half-cent?
Not on the half cent. The half cent, there would be no money. I think you're probably thinking of St. Louis Works, which is
St. Louis Works.
Yeah, that's not part of this budget.
So each ward will get. They're not going to touch the St. Louis Works money.
No,
get that, but that's hardly going to go nowhere. Okay, well, I'm going to pick my budget books up and look. To see where, I mean, there's got to be some places we can come up with a little bit of money for these wards. But anyway, I'll step out. I'll mute myself out. Thank you.
Woman Howard, any questions, Mr. Payne?
Yes, I want to go back to slide 21 just for some clarity. As I look at that, you've identified that now is that fiscal year 20. We had a fund balance of 42.8 mil, or is that correct on slide 21?
On slide 21, fiscal year 20, that would mean at the end of, at the beginning of this current fiscal year on a cash basis, we had a balance of 42.8 million.
Okay. So you're projecting we will have 26.7 maybe.
Yeah, and there's a number of caveats. So basically, we know that revenue is going to decline for two reasons. One is that almost let's say it's roughly half of it's in the earnings tax being deferred because of the 90-day extension from April to July. That was about $19.5 million in the estimate. And again, that will vary, but that's the magnitude we're talking about. So that in and of itself will mean, would suggest that we're going to have a deficit this year, which is a decline in our fund balance. But if we turn around and give that back, then we restore that we could then increase our balance again back up to that. Now, that assumes that we can bridge our operating costs and our revenues such that we don't draw any more than that. And that's what it's sort of, I usually don't do a projection going forward on fund balance. It's usually what it actually was. But in this, I just wanted to indicate where it stood. And so if we can successfully bridge this year's gap, then you'd be around the $46 million range.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay. But at this point, you're projecting 26.7 due to the COVID. And I guess.
And the earnings tax deferral, you're right.
Right. So we are targeting 10% on reserve, correct?
Right.
Is what we should have. And we've never actually met that up until last year. Is that, I mean.
Well, we didn't actually meet that. We got over, if you can see, just going back historically, we were always trailing even our minimum for the longest time. We're slowly going up, but always trailing. We finally surpassed that in last fiscal year.
So anyway, the deficit remains, but I just was, it's hard when we were doing so well to get this punch in the gut like this. But I guess I agree. We have to go with the worst, or the projection, worst case, not worst, but and try to make it work out. But that helps some clarity. So what the projection in summary to clarity in my mind is the 46.2 is what you would have anticipated had the COVID not happened. Is that correct?
Actually, it may have been higher simply because our revenues were tracking higher at the time. So we may have actually getting close to meeting our actual 10%. Now I don't expect that anymore. So.
And then one more question. People are not eating out of the restaurant. We don't get the restaurant tax, but I noticed that, Lowe's, a lot of the hardware stores, the grocery stores, people are buying food. And do we have a read on that? If there's any, I guess, balance in that from the restaurants versus
That's a good question. It's still a little early. I have seen May's receipts. That's the only thing I've gotten since actually presenting the budget originally. May was a little bit of a mixed bag. We saw the decline in the earnings. It wasn't quite as big as I was projecting there. And then you had the deferral. Again, not quite as big. Sales tax was actually up a little bit, which sort of surprised me. Now the sales tax would have represented mostly March. Now, if you remember, March was a split because the first half of the month was somewhat normal. The second half is when it started declining. I think the real telltale report is going to be June, because June will mostly reflect all the activity from April. And as well as any of the declines in hiring and all that, a lot of that's going to be reflected in June's report. I expect June's report to be the worst. Now, and this is sort of difficult in that we're straddling 2 fiscal years. So the question is going to be how much of this negative result is going to be in this year versus next year. Now, the way this has been laid out, I've got this year having 3 months, basically the fourth quarter being, pretty much washed out.
COVID, yeah.
And then slowly recovering beginning in July. It may be that maybe we only have 2 months so much of that decline this year, of a severe decline of this year, and that July is actually also a bad month, and then it starts recovering. And so if that's the case, then you would not have as big a gap in the current fiscal year, but your gap next year is bigger. And I think once we get a little bit more, I definitely think June may give us a little bit more information in terms of how that's going. And I think the name of this game is going to be being able to adjust and being sort of the ability to adjust the budget in a timely way so that we can get the best estimate and adjustment so that we've got something in place by July 1. And then subsequently, if we see that it's also continuing to slide, that we've got levers in place so that we can make adjustments going forward during the fiscal year as well.
So being agile is key here.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all I have.
All right. Alderwoman Hubbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. And of course, thank you, Budget Director. I think your last sentence kind of summed everything up that I was thinking as far as how do we adjust, in light of the projections, and how, if in fact numbers go down, go up, is not as bad, it is bad. How do we, make those concessions? So you answered that somewhat. I've just been trying to follow along. This is still new to me. This process is always fast paced because I'm trying to look at the charts and listen to what you say. So I hope the process will go as it has always been, with the different departments coming before us, kind of giving us their ideas of what they need. But just specifically, can you tell me what was the capital improvement dollar amount for each ward? What was the projection on that?
Well, in terms of the proposed budget, there wasn't going to be any new money allocated for the ward account. That's.
So next year there won't be any money for ward capital. Okay.
That's correct.
Okay, and so this is kind of off topic, but like of any of the relief dollars that have come to the city or that are anticipated to come to the city, will they be used in any way to supplement the budget?
I believe that's still being explored, because I know we've started receiving some of those grant funds that have been appropriated through the state of Missouri. Most of those have been targeted for actual direct COVID-19 efforts, as opposed to relieving cities or states of shortfalls in revenue. So there may be some overlap a little bit, maybe in salaries and things like that, but most of that's going to be directed towards, purchasing of PPE equipment and things like that. So none of that is incorporated in the FY21 budget. It's a separate, those are separate funds. But yeah, unfortunately, none of that is being anticipated to relieve our budget gap at this point in time anyway.
Okay. And so at this time, that's all I have for now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tamika. Alderwoman Murphy.
No questions. They were asked and answered. We just have to wait and see. Thank you, Paul. This is excellent presentation. Sad, but excellent. And I guess we just have to wait and see as we go through the individual things. So thank you so much.
All right. Alderwoman Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Paul, for this in-depth presentation here. And thank you for the time you spent with several of us outside of this process to better understand and get to some level of understanding before we got here. As I mentioned to you separately, I have concerns that we are over projecting revenues. What I'd like to see is if we go back to slide, the slides 6 and 7, where we're just sort of describing in word form what the assumptions are, if that is possible to kind of look on a quarter by quarter or monthly basis, just to see the reductions by the type. I'm kind of looking to what other cities are doing. Detroit, for example, just passed their COVID budget, and that included a $194 million shortfall out of a $1.1 billion budget. That's anticipating a little less than 20% shortfall. For their budget, of course, they have a revenue stream that looks different than St. Louis City does. But understanding that the enormity there compared to what we're projecting is there's a significant difference there. I have some real concerns about assuming that we're going to get back to any semblance of normalcy by the end of the year or even next year. Rob Dixon of the Missouri Department of Economic Development earlier this week projected or announced that we're not expecting Missouri revenues to get back to normal for another 5 years. And so taking those things into account, I see the city of St. Louis getting back to normal as being a best case scenario. And I'd like us to make sure that we're keeping that in mind as we move forward. I know we're going to have to hopefully adjust these numbers moving forward. I have a couple of questions. The special funds, the gaming fund, for example, how are some of these funded? Is that the gaming fund, for example? Can you remind us where the revenue stream is for that?
Yeah, the gaming funds strictly the two sources of revenue are received from the Lumiere Casino.
Right.
The admissions, the share of the state admissions, as well as the 10% share of the adjusted gross receipts.
The gaming fund will get back to normal, is assuming that we open those casinos, don't have any problems, and people attend them to the same level or to a similar level as before. I think those are.
Well, yeah. Let's, for instance, so you want to talk about those. You can talk about the gaming funds. So, for instance, we're expecting an 80% drop in revenue in the current fiscal year for those 2 months, and actually no receipts for May through May, and then an 80% drop in June, and then recovering 20% a month through the end of the calendar year. That was in the base proposal, and in the alternative scenario, it recovers at a rate, but it never reaches that full amount. It's like down 10%. Again, based on all of these are going to be based on assumptions, so you're not going to know for sure, but we're going to be tracking these on a monthly basis, and so that would advise us on what any sort of adjustments we need to make going along the way.
Yeah, and Paul, would you be able to share some of those sort of monthly or quarterly,
Sure.
stuff? I think that would be really helpful. It's certainly helpful to have it written in form, but for numbers folks, it's helpful to have that laid out.
Sure.
The reduction in sales tax, you're looking at 11.4% reduction in those kind of sales tax funds, the local parks, et cetera.
Right.
My gut is that these are overly optimistic. These are I wouldn't say overly optimistic. Of course, these came to us several weeks ago, and the world is continuing to change on a daily basis. So as you pointed out several times, that we've got to be nimble here. There's going to be a lot of shifts in this. I just worry that, some of these things, for example, the public safety sales tax, this is something that we've used to pay salaries for our police department, which we're not projecting to reduce in manpower. So looking at that is we've got a difference of 1 million, at least $1 million, going to several million. That's the deficit there is going to have to come from the general fund, presumably. And so that's going to add the deficits in these special funds will then add to the deficits to the general fund, or at least some of them will.
Yeah, and I actually spoke to that a little earlier when I went through the Gaap, projected Gaap. Those funds, which are basically, like you said, are the sales tax funds, the only backstop we have is the general revenue. So when I presented the Gaap, the projected Gaap for FY21, you'll see that almost $5 million was related to that very thing, saying, hey, look, these revenues are falling short. The general fund's the backstop, so the general fund budget goes up simply because that fund goes down, and so that's exactly the kind of thing you see in those funds.
This is going to be a very, very ongoing process, I think, as we kind of go through the next year, and we're going to have to continue to make cuts. Looking at specifically the manpower or the positions that have cut, the 89 some odd that we are projecting to go down. Have we made any of those cuts as at this point? For example, like the MSI, the corrections, I think that you mentioned that's really the bulk of the reduction of staffing. As we've seen that population over at MSI greatly reduced, has the city already made manpower cuts in that department? Or is this?
Most of those are vacant positions. So basically what we're doing there is as they become vacant, they're not filling them up.
Okay.
And so the budget reflects the reduction in the staffing there.
Do we have, so in other words, are the 89 that we've reduced at MSI already vacated?
Right. Yes, I believe that's true, yeah.
And then are we projecting to have any further vacancies in a reduction there?
We do have some salary savings budgeted in the Justice Center. Now, there's a small salary savings in MSI, but that's de minimis now because we've taken out most of those vacant positions. But we would still expect some vacancies to occur at Justice Center.
Okay. Going to the special funds, you know, we have been on the receiving end, or at least in theory, I don't know that we've actually got the check in the mail, but of $35 million from that CARES Act funding through the state of Missouri. You know, to our colleague from the Fifth Ward's questions about that, we have a fairly transparent process here where we're allocating these funds, you know, through a budget process. It's my understanding that we have a transparency porthole for those funds that hasn't been updated in over a month, but we're continuing to make expenditures. What is the process for spending those funds?
You know, these are a separate appropriation or separate allocations to the city from this particular grant fund. And I know there are restrictions placed on those funds based on the federal authorization for which they've been issued. I believe they're being spent under the authority of the health commissioner, given under his charter authority for emergency spending related to a pandemic. And that would be the authority, at least for the ones that directly relate to pandemic related spending. I don't know the extent of any of the other funds that we've received in anticipation of a supplemental appropriation for those. I can't speak to that detail, but I do know that's not contained within the proposed budget.
And is the budget office a part of the appropriations or the, you know, budgeting for those funds, or is that happening outside of your office?
Yeah, no, we haven't been involved directly with those funds.
Okay. Okay, and then going back just to this, you know, the projections, and you've mentioned several times that there's a lot of assumptions, a lot of this will be up in the air. The process for kind of being nimble through that, I know we've talked a little bit offline, but are we anticipating, you know, should we anticipate some new numbers coming our way? Or is that something we should just wait and see how that's going to unfold, you know, as
I would expect that to be the case, particularly this year. So I expect the first week of June to be a key week because that's going to be when we start receiving our results from the previous month's activity. And so that, as I was thinking through it, I think this year will be definitely unusual, and that typically you don't get that kind of an update, and because it's not that much movement and it's not that much change in between when you submit a budget and when you pass a budget. But in this year, it's going to be, I think, unusually changed. So I would expect there to be an update somewhere around the first week of June, to where we've actually got more revenue information. And then if we have to make adjustments in the budget, and we have to make, let's say it's more of an amalgam between the base scenario and some of our contingencies, that's going to have to be worked in, and obviously have to be involved both Ways and Means as well as E&A to address that. And the idea being that at some point before the budget's finally passed, it reflects our best estimate of where we stand at that time. And then obviously monitoring that going forward as the fiscal year progresses is going to be a big part of this. And I can also say, I've sort of looked around at other cities as well, and everyone's sort of in the same boat, and they've taken different approaches. You mentioned Detroit. There are other cities that say, oh, well, we're just going to appropriate the current year's budget and adjust, or we're going to do it this way. But you can see that every city is sort of struggling in the same fashion with this. I think what's very important, and particularly when we talk to rating agencies and all, what they're looking for is not necessarily a right or wrong answer when it comes to that. They're looking for, how are you planning for various contingencies should a different outcome result? And I think that's what we need to be thinking about. Would be, all right, we've got this projection. If it does go worse, how do we preserve our options for addressing it going forward? And that's what they're going to be looking for.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you again. I know you've got a very, very tough job to do with regards to being, figuring this out on a daily basis. And there's a lot of juggling that has to go on here. So I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all the questions I have at this time.
John? There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one question for the director. My son has math homework. Can I send him to your office?
We'll have to work out a fee.
No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Alderman. Alderman Oldenburg, you're up.
Video there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Paul, probably the toughest budget that you put together, at least in the last 10 years, right?
Absolutely.
I want to thank you and your office for putting together what is a thoughtful analysis of kind of trying to find the bottom of the situation that really doesn't have a bottom. I just have a couple of quick questions. So slide 9 really kind of sums up the proposed cuts, correct?
Yes.
And then on slide 22, these are potential contingencies to be prepared for. And is it safe to assume that in some fashion there could be a swap of kind of the proposed budget fill on slide 9 with what those contingencies are laid out in slide 22?
That could actually occur. Yeah. Now, my only caveat to that would be you want to make sure that simply because if you take it from the contingency and swap something out, you still need contingencies. And so you don't want to preclude yourself from coming back to it if you need it, because otherwise you're defeating the purpose of having the contingency.
Yep, I understand. But there's an ability to potentially prioritize with what's a contingency that is exactly that, may not come to fruition and be needed with something that's currently presented.
Yes.
And then also, Alderwoman from the 14th hit on the reserve graph, which I think is, what is that? Slide 21, maybe?
Okay.
And I understand effectively we're bridging what is the projected earnings tax that we won't get now till July in the next fiscal year. And then when that comes, the earnings tax will replenish the reserve fund, correct?
Right.
And then that doesn't assume what was a resolution passed in the Parking Commission and is now being presented tomorrow, a $5 million transfer, I think Board Bill 13. That would not be reflected in here, correct?
That does not. It does not.
Great. So in theory, if that board bill passes and the money gets transferred, the reserve fund could have an additional $5 million. Yes.
Now, I will caution you on one thing, and this is one of the adjustments I was going to have to make on revenues. The 60-40 split with parking. Right now, it's still assumed at the regular rate, which I think it was 1.7 or whatever. I assume that's going to be probably less than half, simply because they're not in operations either, and that may be $1 million deduction on the revenue side. That's just one of those kind of adjustments we're going to have to make before the budget gets finalized.
Okay, that's great. All right, I have no further questions at this time. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Alderman. Alderwoman Boyd, any questions of Mr. Payne?
Sorry.
I don't have any questions. Thank you for answering.
No. Alderwoman Boyd.
Said Alderwoman.
My bad.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Chair. Paul, thank you, because I know you've been really working hard on this. But I guess my question, is there anywhere else in the special funds account that you can cut?
Well, actually on the as we talked about that contingency list. I've got some of those items on there. Those were, for instance, if you look at the Economic Development Sales Tax Fund, there are a number of items that have been appropriated there, which have not been either not been spent or are budgeted for next year, that we could say, okay, if, as Alderman referenced, if we find this to be a higher priority than this, could you swap them out? And so theoretically, yeah, you could do that. There's a list of those on there. And obviously, we're going to also be looking at it, the other special funds as well, because we're still in the fiscal year, and you want to make sure you don't take money that's either on its way out the door or been committed somehow. But there are some of there on that list, on that page.
And I'm glad you're referring to that, because I guess what I'm looking at as a city is certain communities that have not been getting services in the beginning. And so I'm looking at two things: safety and the communities as a whole. And certain communities have not received like forestry and those kind of departments. They don't have the staff as it is. And so we're looking at cutting staff, and I'm asking, and you probably answered that earlier, we could look at somewhere else to cut, because I know streets and forestry and parks have cut already in their departments, and they haven't filled the positions that they have, and they have had a decline. And so I'm looking at a lot of programs that we're saying we recommended to cut, which I think relies back to safety, because we're trying to reduce the crime and the violence in our community on one hand, but you're looking at suspending summer day camps and boxing programs and programs to that issue. And then we have the trash task force that has done a tremendous job with the little staff that they have. So now we're looking to reduce that, which to me is going to cause an impact on us, an increase of dumping, the street sweeping, and then we have trash. And so I don't think people are realizing this corona is environmental. So it's going to impact us worse because we don't have those services.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of thing that we're going to have to weigh as this budget progresses, because as you mentioned, you see some things that might be a higher priority than others, and so that's definitely something you're going to have to again put on the scale and see which ones are more important. Addressing some of those issues, for instance, like the summer pool season, that kind of thing. Well, I don't know necessarily what's been determined yet whether there actually will be one, and so the question then becomes, well, if you're not having that, do you still, I mean, you still have employees who are assigned to that. So, I mean, they're either going to be furloughed or reassigned or something that you would not need the personnel to run the program. So what do you do in that instance? And so that would be reflected here. And I think that's sort of reflective of how other businesses have been treating, for instance, the restaurant industry as, hey, look, if they're not open, they're gonna furlough their employees. And so that's a potential, actually. And it's something we're going to have to decide on what to do. But as I mentioned, first off, if you want to swap one thing or another, that can be done. But we still need to maintain our flexibility, because the whole purpose of having a list of potential cuts is that we may actually need to have these. We may actually need to do some of these or a good chunk of them, depending because of the revenue uncertainty. And and that's going to be sinking in as both throughout the rest of this budget process, and as the fiscal year progresses. We're not going to exactly still know where this is going to bottom out, and so we got to keep our powder dry on some of these things.
Okay, and so with the MSI, you did a reduction of their budget because of the staff, and they had a large reduction of staff.
Right, that's correct.
So do you foresee any more reduction in the staff with a reduction of inmates?
Well, from a budget standpoint, we've pretty much reduced almost all the vacant positions from MSI. And so I would suspect, I don't know. It depends on what happens with the census. I mean, they're pretty low right now. But if you look back, let's say the beginning of March, They were still over a couple hundred at that point. So that remains to be seen what happens with the census over at MSI. The Justice Center, we do, as I mentioned earlier, we do have some salary savings there. And I would expect that if jobs open up there and there's some more reductions in staff or at MSI, then there may be some transferring of positions from MSI to the Justice Center. But again, that's all dependent on what the census does.
Okay, and so we have $2 million in employee benefit funding. Can we use any of those dollars?
Which amount?
Employee benefit funding.
Well, the one amount that we utilized in this fiscal year, and this was actually just a one-off pretty much, was the benefits fund where we're self-insured. We have a fully insured medical plan, but then the pharmacy piece of that is self-insured. And those amounts that we contribute are established each year by the consultant who looks at those things and say, okay, this is how much we need to pay each year. Well, in looking at our actual funds over time, the self-funded pharmacy benefit plan had added to a significant balance to where it topped 12.8, is that the number I used? 12.8 million at the end of FY19, which seems excessive, and it was excessive. So the question was, well, it is self-funded, so you want to make sure you have enough funds in there to address any uncertainty and such. But how much reasonably can we draw that down? And so in talking with the Director of Personnel, we ended up removing 9.8 million of that and utilizing that to reduce the amount that we were contributing to health insurance in the budget. So you'll see the line item for health insurance in most department budgets went down. 7.4 of that is in general fund. But remember, you have other departments that can just, like airport, water, the grants and everything else contribute. So that's not all general fund. But a good portion of it was, and so that did help. And that's in one of those things we'll keep an eye on to make sure that if available funds are there, then we could adjust that down further. But again, given that it's self-insured, there is no backstop, so you want to make sure you're covered in that case in an insurance policy like that.
All right, thank you so much for all your help.
All right, thank you, Alderwoman Boyd. Alderwoman Clark Hubbard, any questions of Mr. Payne?
No questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Payne, for all your hard work and your efforts. I look forward to working with you and the committee on this budget process.
All right. Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Nothing but fun here this year. I can, right. I'm going through on a personal level here at work, but I guess last year was vanilla, year before was Rocky Road. Right now we have low-fat yogurt here in front of us.
Cottage cheese.
All right. If we have nothing else, we're going to, I guess we're done with Mr. Payne. There's any other, anyone want to raise a hand or have any other comments? We can probably hold off and get all our presentations next Tuesday at the next meeting. Are we all right?
Yeah, Joe, just quickly, I'll pick my books up Monday. When do you propose to do? Are you going to bring different groups in?
They'll be on tomorrow's calendar on the agenda. Our schedule is Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday for all the department heads, starting at 10 a.m. We'll be taking a lunch break. Sorry, I can't buy you lunch this year. You're on your own.
But, you can mail it to my house.
Yeah, I'll mail something to you. So we have Tuesday, our marathon starts Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday next week. We'll have all the department heads before us with a lunch break in between on each day.
Okay,
so
thank you. All roughly about 10 o'clock starting time?
Yeah, they all 10 a.m. starts, every one of them, yes.
Okay, thank you, Joe.
You're welcome. Anyone else, any comments before we adjourn for today and let you digest all this wonderful information? Okay, if not, with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn today's meeting.
So moved.
Second.
So moved.
Second.
Second, all right. And we all are present, so there's no need to excuse any of the aldermen. With that, I thank you all for your time and get some rest. It's going to be a long week next Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And I hope you have comfortable chairs. Paul, thank you again. It can't be any fun at all. I know it's not any fun at all on my end. Thank you, sir. Thank everyone, and I'll be signing off. Meeting adjourned.